Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from AlexMercedCoder.com, and it has been a while since I've put out a new video because I was moving. So I am now moved. I'm now situated in my new office, so I don't have the green screen up, so you're gonna get my full screen. I'll adjust that a little bit so that we don't see as much. So let's just adjust that just a little bit so you don't have to see so much of my space. There we go. Okay, but bottom line is what I want to do is just kind of create a whole new series teaching sort of like web development. So I'm going to start from scratch. I've done videos on like everything, and now I'm going to kind of start over. Okay, so we're going to start off with an introduction to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Each of the building blocks of web development. So if you're looking to just like casually understand how to build websites, or you are looking to switch to career to be a full-time web developer or web application developer, well, this is the starting place. Okay, this will kind of get you started. So there's a couple things I need you to do before we get started. One, I need you to download this piece of software right here. It's called Visual Studio Code. Now, what Visual Studio Code is what you call an editor. That's going to allow pretty much most of programming is done by writing text. Okay, all your programming, all your code are text in text files that, basically things like compilers compile, or things like interpreters interpret. Okay, which at the end of the day just means run the code. So the difference is compile is like there's an extra step. You compile the code into a binary, and then you can run the binary. That's like you running your program. While an interpreter does both at the same time. It's going to basically compile the code and run it at the same time every time you run the program. Either way, the point is you write code in text files, and these things allow you to run your code. Okay, so we're specifically be working with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and you're going to want Visual Studio. Let's look up the website, Visual Studio Code. Okay, so you go to this code.visualstudio.com, and this is where you'll download it. It should automatically detect your, it should automatically detect your operating system, and you can download it from there. So you want to have that. And the other thing you want to get familiar with is this thing called the terminal. Okay, we're not going to spend too much time with that today, but essentially what the terminal is, it's the way you interact with your computer. Okay, every operating system has a terminal. There's different types of terminals, but they all do the same thing. They allow you just to kind of send commands for your computer to do things. And trust me, as you learn how to work with a terminal, it's much better than just pointing and clicking at things. Okay, but once you have Visual Studio Code open, so what you're going to want to do is just open it to a folder. So what you'll do is you'll click Open Folder, okay, and then you're going to want to open it to a folder. And what you can do is you click this little button here, the Create a Folder. It might look a little bit different depending on your operating system, because again, the way these file and open dialog boxes look like are dependent on your operating system. And then you just create a folder and say, hey, I want to create a folder called HTML, CSS, JavaScript 101. Okay, and then once you're in the folder that you want to work out of, you just click Open. And what this does is that it's going to open Visual Studio Code, and you can tell what folder you're in because it's listed right over here. So that means, hey, when I'm working here in VS Code, I'm working out of that folder. Now ignore the colors. So like the colors that you see here, like how my thing is purple, that's not built into VS Code. So your VS Code is not going to do that out of the box. VS Code can be extended. So basically you can add extra features to VS Code by clicking on extensions. So see this like little Tetris block thing here? This is where you add extensions. So I can go over here and say, hey, I want to add the functionality that adds those colors. That's a extension called Peacock. Okay, and this allows you to change the color. It basically helps you create colors between different workspaces, because you might have different Visual Studio Code windows open and you want to know which one's which, and that certainly helps. So if you're wondering how those colors magically appear, every time I open up the window, that's how that happens. Okay, I'm not going to get too much into VS Code extensions here. We're just going to start actually getting into like making a website. So bottom line is that whenever I want to create a new file, I can click either this button here that's going to create a new file in the context of the folder that's this folder, or I can create a new folder. So let's say I wanted to create a new file. Okay, and I'm going to create a file called index.html. Now, basically, if you're not familiar with how files work, generally the idea is that there's a file name. So index is the file name, and then there's like an extension that tells you what kind of file it is. So that's the .html. So it's an HTML file called index. Okay, and that extension allows different pieces of software to know, hey, this is this kind of file. So basically right now it knows that it's an HTML file, so you get this little icon next to it. Okay, cool. Basically everything in the web are HTML files. Okay, so every website is just a bunch of HTML files that your browser, that's like Google Chrome, Internet, well, maybe not Internet Explorer anymore, but Internet like Microsoft Edge, Opera, Brave, any of these browsers, they are designed to be able to render the instructions from that HTML to create the page that you see. Okay, now typically the main page of every website is called index.html. Okay, that's standard. Most web servers are designed to treat that file a little bit differently than it would treat any other file by any other name. Okay, it's always going to assume that if you go to a domain name, if I go to like xyz.com, it's going to look for the index.html. If I wanted to get like cheese.html, I'd have to be like xyz.com/cheese.html. Okay, and we'll show you what I mean. Okay, so basically right now, in HTML, what you do is it's a markup language. So what you're really doing is you're saying, hey, I have some text, like, hey, let's say this is my title. So I want to write a title. Okay. I want to write a title. And then here's some text that should go below that title. Okay. Right now I have no HTML in this file. So it has no, so really like even though I wrote the word title here and I wrote some text here, it doesn't know that this is supposed to be literally treated as a title. And then this is some text. It's just, there's just text in the file. So now what you can do is, actually what you want to do is download an extension called Live Server. So you head over to the extension thing and download Live Server. And you want to make sure you install this Live Server extension. What this allows you to do is create a server right out of the folder that you're working out of. Okay, so if I right click on this index.html file, I'll see this new extension. Now that I've added that extension, I see this new command called open with Live Server. Okay, and I can run that. And now it creates a server running on my local computer. Another name for, there's two names your local computer has. Your computer is always referred to as either 127.0.0.1. So think of that as like, you know, how there's like google.com. That is, google.com has a computer that's behind it. And that computer has an IP address. But basically the IP address of the computer that you are on is always 127.0.01. So 127.0.01 will always point to the computer that you are currently on. Another name for 127.0.01 is localhost. Okay, so sometimes you'll see localhost. Localhost is just a word. The browser knows that whenever you go to localhost, what you're really saying is 127.0.01. In the same way that when you type in google.com, it knows that that really means some other IP address for some computer somewhere else. The only difference is that this is based on your computer. When I type in google.com, it goes to this other, like this big internet phone book called the Domain Name Service, DNS, and says, hey, what is the IP address of google.com? And that's how it figures it out. Okay, but see, there's my website. Okay, and you see, look, it just looks ugly. It doesn't know. Basically, the idea is that it knows that this content, there's this text, but it has no idea what the context of the text is. And that's what HTML is doing. HTML allows us to provide context to the content that we have. Okay, so for example, I can say, hey, this is a title, and there's a tag called H for heading. And depending on how big the heading you want, 1 being the biggest, 6 being the smallest, I can say, hey, this is going to be an H1. But now notice how I get 2 tags. Okay, so basically what happens is that this is the beginning of the heading and this is the end of the heading. So how does the browser know what text is supposed to be part of the heading? Is whatever's in between. So that means I want to move this title inside of the 2 tags. So now it knows that what's wrapping the tags is a heading. Okay, now basically since I'm using Live Server, what Live Server does, it pays attention to any time our website, I change the text files, or I change these files in this folder, and it's going to refresh the page. So now when I go back to the browser, I can see, well, it didn't refresh. Now if I refresh it now, see, I see that the title now looks different. That's because the HTML told the browser, hey, this text should be treated as a heading, and made it treated like as a heading. Okay, and typically when you're talking about like paragraphs, text paragraphs, usually we'd use a p tag. Okay, so then I would put like a p tag around the text. That's my content here. Okay, but the idea is that in HTML, there's always an opening tag, which is always like these angle brackets, the name of the tag, and then the closing tag has a little slash in front of it saying, hey, like this is where this p tag ends. Okay. Now usually you shouldn't write your HTML files like this. Okay. There's a lot of boilerplate that you should add. Now VS Code makes this a lot easier for you because it has a tool built into it called Emmet. And then Emmet allows you to use like abbreviations to write your HTML. So I can create the boilerplate for your typical HTML file by using the exclamation point. So if I just type a single exclamation point in Visual Studio Code in a HTML file, I'm going to get this popping up. And see, this just means this first one, so you can see it says Emmet abbreviation, is going to set up all my HTML boilerplate. Okay, so essentially that's really like how your HTML file should look like to begin with. Okay, this is your boilerplate. Because typically what you want is you want this doc type, because that's going to basically tell the browser that for sure this is an HTML file. Then you want your entire document wrapped in this HTML tag saying, hey, this is where all the HTML is. Okay, and then you have like these properties. So an HTML tag can have what's called attributes, and attributes can sometimes give those HTML tags little special flavors or instructions. Okay, so certain browsers may care about this attribute, so because then it knows that, okay, this is an English page. Okay, which, you know, probably if you're based out of an English speaking country, this probably doesn't matter to you because it's probably like the default. But if you're in a non-English speaking country, having this little attribute on your HTML tag can mean the difference between how that browser treats that page. Okay, and you see there's these tags. Now this head tag, generally the head tag is where you put stuff that doesn't show up on the page. Okay, so basically generally it's going to be more support type stuff. Okay, so you see these meta tags. These meta tags allow you to attach metadata to the page. Again, metadata is not data that people are going to see or access. It's generally going to be things that the browser needs to do its job. Okay, so let's kind of go through some of these examples. So like right here, this meta tag is specifying the character set, saying, hey, to the browser. And again, most of these are default. So like at the end of the day, if I didn't include these things before and it worked, because generally most of these things are going to be these values by default. Okay, but the idea is generally good to explicitly state them, because you never know if the user opens up your website in the browser that doesn't have the same defaults. Okay, so the character set has to do with like how it interprets the text. Okay, so it's going to be using what's called UTF-8. You know, ever notice that we have all these emojis nowadays? Okay, that's because we have the way we encode text is in a way that allows us to have a lot more possible characters. Before, we used to use a system called ASCII, which had a much more limited number of possible characters. UTF-8, I'm not going to get into how UTF-8 works, not really important right now, but it allows us to have a lot more characters, which is why you can now pretty much use any character you want, and all these emojis, and they're constantly adding new ones, because the possible number of characters you can refer to basically is a lot bigger. Okay, there's a good video if you look up like the UTF-8 miracle on YouTube. You'll find a great video that explains how UTF-8 works really well. Okay, so here's like some other information. I'm not quite exactly sure what these two attributes do. Feel free to Google it. Okay, that's one thing you want to do if you're becoming a developer. One thing you want to get used to doing is being curious and asking questions. So hey, I might care what this attribute means. I'm like, hey, what is this? What I can do is I can head over to Google, and then I would say, okay, HTML, because I know I'm talking about HTML. I know that thing, I know that's what I'm looking to get defined, and I know it's an attribute, because again, any of those little like this equals that things inside of an HTML tag is called an attribute. So I can say, hey, you know, what is, and then just add what is, so that way it knows I'm looking for a definition. And let's see what I get. So the HTTP equivalent attribute provides an HTTP header for information value. Okay, it doesn't mean much to me, but I can look that up now. So again, be curious. If you really want to kind of grow in the skill set, you got to be curious, because you're going to constantly run into things and see like examples of other people's code that use things you haven't seen before. And the only way for you to know what those things are is just to go look them up. Okay, so like I'm telling you from someone who's been doing this for several years now, that you're just constantly just having to kind of look things up. And then oftentimes you're gonna look up things you looked up before because you'll forget. Okay, it's just too much information. Okay, so that's what these are. So these are all kind of giving that information. Generally, no need to touch these. But then there's this title tag. This title tag determines what you see here. So you see, like right now, I see 127.0.01, 550, whatnot. Now, if I change this title tag, I should change what we see there. So let's say, cheese. Okay, so my title is cheese. If I refresh the page, see that becomes cheese. Okay, so that's all the title tag does. It's going to allow you to determine what shows up in the tab. Okay, so now everything visual should go in the body. Okay, so right now there's nothing in the body, so there's nothing on the screen. Okay, so then I would want to put like an H1 here. Hello, I'm the title. Okay, and sometimes you just want some dummy text. Okay, so what I can do is I can create a p tag. And notice how it's auto completing the tags for me. That's not something that it automatically does. Okay, that's an extension. Okay, so let me see if I can find the extension that does that. See, auto close tag and auto rename tag. So auto close tag is automatically making these ending tags for me when I type up the opening tag, which is, for me is pretty useful. And then let's say I wanted to change this to something else, like I want to change it to a div. Notice how it automatically renamed the closing tag for me. That's this auto rename tag extension. So those are two extensions that I find pretty useful personally. But maybe better not to use them in the beginning because you want to get used to writing it out yourself before you depend too much on extensions. The problem is if you get too dependent on extensions, then what happens is when you need to do this for like an interview, you're going to forget how to do it because you're just not used to it. Okay, like I've done this for a long time before I used the extension, so I could do this pretty comfortably without the extensions if I had to. Okay, so I'm not building this dependency that puts me at a disadvantage when I don't have them. Okay, so keep that in mind because a lot of people just go full on for all these different extensions and they get really, really dependent on them. And then the minute they go to an interview, they just fall flat because they've gotten too dependent on their tools, which they won't have during an interview. Okay, cool. So let me just go back to a p tag. Okay. And let's just type in. Now, here's I want to just put in some dummy text. So a good Emmet abbreviation when you just need some dummy text is you start typing in the word lorem. Okay, lorem. So then you get this Emmet abbreviation. And I can be like lorem. And then see, it just gives me some like generic nonsense text. But now I can actually like see this. Now, when it comes to HTML tags, just so you understand, there's two types of tags. Every tag generally is going to fall in one of two categories. Okay, so these are both what's called a block tag. So one of the things you can do is that here in Visual Studio Code and pretty much any browser, you can use what's called dev tools. So the easiest way to do it is you can right click and click inspect. Okay, you can also do like Control Shift I. Okay, but if I click here and inspect, it's going to open up this set of tools. These tools are here to help you as a web developer kind of understand like, oh, like what's going on with my website and diagnose things and figure things out. So now if I go here and I click this little tool right here, I can highlight different sections. So now notice I can see here what space this actual thing is taking up. So notice it's taking up the full space left and right. Okay, the full space left and right. And then if I highlight this, here's the p tag. It's highlighting, again, takes up the full space left and right. That's how a block by default works. So anytime there's like a new block, they stack on top of each other. So you can see here, like this block stacks on top of this block. Okay. Again, if I took that same stuff and I put it outside of these tags and I just said, hey, hello, and then did space and then did lorem and did that, like, watch what happens here. So you see this is all on the same line because it doesn't know that they're two different blocks. Okay. So generally that's called inline. Okay, so inline is like text here, where basically everything stays on the same line. So everything in HTML is either inline, so it's going to be treated like text, okay, or, so to show you an example of an inline property. So like for example, let me just actually make a smaller set of words. So let's say here I'm the title. If I were to put the tag span around I'm the, okay, you're gonna notice that nothing changed. The reason being is a span is an inline tag. Like I've marked those words, so now I have this tag that is wrapping. Like if I take a look here, down here in the DevTools, there's the HTML. So if I open up that H1, see I see the span tag's right there. Okay, but it has no visual impact. Okay, there's reasons why you still want to use it. Okay, because I can use it to reference, if I need to do something special to those two words, which I'll show you in a second. But it's inline. It doesn't change the flow of the text. So again, but if I had changed that to something like a div or a p tag or an h1 tag, which are all block elements, it would have like gave it its own separate row. Okay, so that's the main thing you want to kind of wrap your head around first. It's like, that things are either going to be inline or block. And one of the things you want to do as you learn more HTML tags is go take a look. Is it inline or block? And you just do that by, Googling it. There's just too many HTML tags, too many CSS elements, which we're going to get into next, and too much JavaScript to just sit there and say, hey, I'm going to memorize it all or know it all the time. You look it up as you need it. Okay, but that's generally the idea of how HTML works. Okay, a few more little HTML pieces to be aware of is, what if I wanted to add a picture? Okay, so now watch what happens if, let's say I want to put a picture like right here. The tag is called image, IMG. Okay. Okay, notice that it didn't create a closing tag because the image HTML tag is special. Image and the input tag, there's a couple of them that are special where they are not required to have a closing tag. You can make one if you want, like it won't hurt you. And if you ever do React later on, you'll have to, but it doesn't require a closing tag in just plain HTML. Now, the way the image tag works is saying, hey, I want to put a picture here. But you have to tell it what picture you're going to send. So what you do is there's an attribute you can put on the image tag called source that allows you to specify the picture that you're going to send. Okay, and there's some other attributes like source set and all this kind of stuff, but to keep it simple, if I go to images, so let's click here on images, and I'm going to go find the picture of a puppy. Okay, so here's an adorable little puppy. What I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on this puppy and I'm going to copy the image address, because what you have to tell it is not what you want to copy is the location of the picture. What's the address to the picture? Okay, and you can tell it's the right address because see at the end there's a file extension and it's like an image. So images are like JPG, PNG, GIF, GIFs, or there's WebP, WEBP. Has to be something that ends in like one of those extensions. Okay, so now if I put that there, let's see how it gets treated. Okay, so notice that the picture, see like right there, it shows up in the middle of the text. The text doesn't like the rest of the text doesn't immediately go to the next line. Images are inline elements. Okay, that's something you want to kind of be aware of very early on. Now all of these things can change. Okay, basically the browser has given you full control of being able to change the visual of any of this stuff, and how, not only like how does it visually look, but how does it treat it? Is it block or is it inline? And this is all done through a different language called CSS. Okay, now the simplest way to start with CSS is to create a style tag. So basically what you can do is in your HTML file you can create a style tag. You're also able to do this in a separate file, which will be a discussion for a different day. Okay, but I can create a style tag, and anything I can write here, I can write what's called CSS. So the way the CSS language works is that I'm trying to say things that match a rule must look or behave this way. Okay, so the simplest thing you can do is just say a particular HTML tag. So I can say, hey, anytime there's a p tag, anything that's inside these curly brackets determines how it's going to behave based on my custom rules. Okay, so for example, I can say, hey, all p tags, the font color. Okay, and again, how do you know all these CSS properties? You learn them over time. Okay, you Google what you need because there's like hundreds, if not thousands, of these like CSS properties, and then they all have like little nuances to them, and you learn them over time. But I say, okay, so basically within these curly brackets, I put the property that I want to change and then the value of it. So I'm gonna say, hey, I want to change them all to blue. Okay, and if I go over here, refresh the page, See, now the p tag, the content in the p tag is now blue. Okay, cool. And then again, you separate each one with a semicolon. So at the end of that, I'll put a semicolon, and I can go into the next property. So what if I want that image tag? So I can say img. If I want that image tag to not wrap, I don't want it to be an inline element. Well, I can change its display property. That's how it works. So like, is it a block? Is it inline? There's all these other fun properties like flex and grid, which are a much deeper discussion for another day. But I can say, you know what? I want images to be a block for this particular file. Okay, and you see now, it takes up its own row. So all the text before it are below its row, and all the text before it is above. Okay, so basically with CSS, I can control how things look like, whether they're centered. You can spend a long time kind of getting familiar with like how the CSS is. And the cool thing with DevTools is that like if I want to experiment with CSS, what I can do is I can go over here and look up any element. So let's say I want to take a look at that image tag that we just changed. So see, I click on the image tag. Then right here, it's going to list all the CSS rules that are currently applying to that thing. So I can go back in here and change it again. I can go back, nah, I want to go change it back to inline. And this doesn't permanently change it. This allows you to experiment. So I can just be in here and like body. Actually, I don't know what to change. Change this back to inline. And see, now I see that behavior again because I changed it back to inline. So if you want to just like temporarily change things to kind of experiment, you can do so from here. Okay, and again, any changes you make here do not stick. In order for that for have a permanent change, you have to change it in the actual file. Okay, but you can do that. So that's how CSS works. And the cool thing is that what if I had multiple images, or let's say the span tag. I could target the span tag, but I might have lots of span tags across my whole page. So what I can do is I can generally do two things. I could either add a class attribute and then put a class, we'll just say like, hey, underline, we'll call it. Okay, and that's called a class. So instead of styling the span element saying, hey, all spans have to be underlined, I can just say, hey, only the ones that have a class of underline. And you see when I put this period here, that tells it that this is a class name, not a tag name. Okay, and then I can just be like, hey, text decoration, underline. Okay, and again, you just pick these up you just Google what you need to change, and you kind of learn these attributes as you go. So now if I go over here, see, it's underlined. Okay, and see, I never said the span, I just said underline because I'm targeting anything that has a matching class. Now the cool thing about classes is you can put them as many elements as you want. Now what if this is like the only span that I want to treat in a particular way? Then you might prefer to use what's called an ID. Okay, and ID is just another way you can kind of name things. So we'll just call this like my span. And if I want to like style that ID, I would just say hashtag. So hash my ID, okay, or my span. As long as this matches the name that I put in here, that's going to work. And now I can go in here and say something like color red. And you can see now it's red. Okay. Now what happens if I do the same rule in 3 different things? Okay, so let's see here. If I go here in the underline and I make it green. Okay, technically both of these rules apply to that span. Okay, which one's going to win? The red one. Okay. But if I comment out the red, so you can actually put these little see these little marks here. Oops. In CSS, I put it. Well, I'll just remove it for a second. Control X. If I remove it for a second, see, it's green. Okay, so basic bottom line, like that's one of the things in CSS. Different types of rules have different priorities, and the way you can kind of find out is if you in here in VS Code you can hover over a particular rule. So if I hover over this, so you came up with this little window, and I have this little thing that's called selector specificity. That's going to tell me like how many points it scores, and there's like 3 tiers. So basically, this first 0, that is 100 points. This is 10 points. This is 1 point. So essentially, this rule here scores 10 points. Now, if I go to an ID, where I'm styling the ID, that scores 100 points. So in that case, when there's rules that conflict, when you have two rules that apply to the same thing, and you can't have both rules happen at the same time, the one with the higher amount of points wins. Okay, so you have to kind of know that about how CSS works, because that's oftentimes the biggest challenge, because you have different rules start conflicting with each other, and you're trying to understand why certain ones take priority. It's all about that specificity. Simplest way to think about it in the beginning is IDs beat classes, and classes beat tags. Okay, it gets a little bit more complicated than that, but that's a good starting place. Okay, last thing we'll kind of talk about is JavaScript. Like sometimes you want code, you want like the website to be interactive, and that's where like JavaScript comes into play. And you can write JavaScript by putting in a script tag. And again, JavaScript, like CSS, could be done in a separate file. Discussion for another day. But the idea is that you can write JavaScript code in a script tag. And the simplest thing you can do is do a console.log. Okay, and a console.log is a function, and functions in JavaScript are things that can take further instructions in these little parentheses. So basically I'm saying, hey, there's this object called console, and inside the console, which represents your console, literally this console right here. So you see the little console thing? It represents that. Okay, in that console, I am able to log things using this log function. And what you do is you pass up what's called a string. A string is a thing with like quotation marks. So I can say hello world. And what it's going to do, it's going to log hello world. Okay. And generally console logs are there really for like the programmer to like log things to help them diagnose things on the website, because you might be worried, hey, is this calculation going on right? Or is this variable worth what I think it is? So you're going to log things to kind of help make things very apparent for you. Okay. So that's going to be, people never realize how much that's going to be like their best friend. But yeah, console.log is going to be a very close friend in the world of programming when it comes to like debugging. Okay, but there's other cool things you can do. So for example, let's just show an example of what you can do with JavaScript, and then I kind of get into the full blows of JavaScript here. I recommend checking out some of my JavaScript masterclass videos to get deeper. But let's create a button. Okay, so generally I have a button. Okay, say I'm a button. Okay, there's a button tag. I say I'm a button, so I created a button right here. I'm a button. Okay, and I want to do is I want to make it click. I want to click that button. Okay, there's a couple different ways you can do this. Okay, the really old school way of doing this is I can go to the button and I can add a onClick property, and then I can write JavaScript in the quotation marks of what I want to happen. So there's a function called prompt, and what prompt does is it allows you to display a message. Okay, so I actually want to use single quotes in here because I use double quotes on the outside. And I can say hello world. So I could do this. So basically what's going to happen is anytime I click on this button, this code is going to get executed. And that's fine for simple things. So like that'll work. If I click here, I'm a button, say hello world. And then it's going to ask me for input. This prompt asks for input. I should have done alert. Okay, so let me just change that to alert. Okay, now if I click on I'm a button, see it says hello world. It'll pop up. Okay, so you could do that. That's typically not done as much anymore. Okay, typically in just plain HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, what we're going to do instead is we'll do that from our JavaScript. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a variable. So I'll create a variable called button. A variable is just a label for me to store some information in. And what I want to do is actually put a reference to that button in this variable. So this website is always referred to as the document. So there's an object called the document that represents the website. Okay, and what I want to do is grab one of the little tags that I have on the website, also referred to as nodes. Okay, so there's this function in the document called the query selector. And what the query selector does, it allows you to use CSS selectors. So in the same way that I could refer to things in CSS, I can now refer to the different things in my website. So if I'm referring to that button, I can refer to it by the name of the HTML tag, which is button. Okay, so what this does, this query selector is going to take a look at the document, find the button, and then put the button in this variable. and now I can actually access the button. Okay, and the button has all these different functions and different things you can access to manipulate it. Okay, simplest thing to know is just that every node has a function called add event listener. Okay, this is going to add an event. Okay, so on this event, something will happen. So on what? Well, on click. Okay, so in the same way we had that event called on click when I typed it on the button, I can specify the part after on. So basically I'm saying, hey, when the click event happens on this button, and then what I can do is I can pass a function as to what happens when that click occurs. Okay, so inside this function here, I can determine, hey, what happens when this button gets clicked. Okay, and I can say, like, alert, I did it. Okay, so again, to recap, we grab the button from the DOM. This is what we're doing with JavaScript. And again, if you watch my later videos, I get deeper into this. So if you watch my DOM masterclass, DOM, document object model, I get really deep into all this JavaScript stuff. I would start off with just like my intro to JavaScript lessons to kind of get there. But again, this will kind of give you a nice overview of how all this kind of fits together. Okay, but yeah, let's try it out. Okay, so if I click the button now, it says I did it. Okay, because basically this script runs the minute my website loads up. So what I did is that the minute the page loaded up, I saved the button to the variable, and then I said, hey, anytime you click that button, run this function. So that now is a thing. Okay, web development is very event oriented because you're generally interacting with a user and you're saying, hey, whenever the user does this to your page, do that. Okay, and JavaScript is going to be kind of how you control a lot of that. So hopefully this gives you a nice introduction to the HTML, CSS, JavaScript technologies and their role in web development. My name is Alex Merced. Have a great day and enjoy. I'll be making more videos, but hopefully you found this helpful.